מסכת שבועות דף כ"ה, נו משנה, אחד דברים של עצמו ואחד דברים של אחרים, ואחד דברים שיש בהן ממש ואחד דברים שאין בהן ממש. If someone takes a false oath, then they are liable to a korban, olev yored. These are called Shevuot bitui. We saw that there are various types, both for the past and the future, and I will do something and won't do something. And now we're including more categories. It doesn't matter whether it has to do with oneself or it has to do with someone else. We're going to see examples of this when something that involves other people. And it doesn't matter whether it's a tangible item or an intangible item. The vow applies to all things, and if one violates the vow and says a false one, then one would be liable to a korban, olev yored, in all these cases. Kesad. Let's see some examples. Amar Shevuot she'eten leish peloni ve'shelo eten, shenatati ve'shelo natati. The example of something has to do with other people is, I make a vow that I will give to that person some item, or that I will not give it to him, or that I gave it to him, or that I did not give it to him. So we see all four categories, past and future, affirmative and negative. Regarding something has to do with other people. Regarding oneself, that's a simple case. I ate, I didn't eat, I will eat, I will not eat. Sheishan v'shelo ishan, sheyashanti v'shelo yashanti, she'ezrok sro layam v'shelo ezrok, she'zarakti v'shelo zarakti. And things that have no mamash, something that has mamash, something that has substance, might be eating, right, where you're actually consuming some physical thing. But if one says, I will eat, or I will not, I will sleep, or I will not sleep. Sleeping is not a tangible item. It's not something that you can point to and weigh and put somewhere, but just an action, or that I did sleep or that I didn't sleep, so the positive and the negative in past and the future. Or another example of something that has no mamash is that I will throw a stone into the sea, or I will not throw a stone into the sea, or I did throw a stone into the sea yesterday, or I did not throw a stone into the sea. Throwing a stone into the sea is an inconsequential act. It's a physical act. You can point to the stone, you can point to the sea, but there's not going to be any after effect of it. It's not a significant act, as enbo mamash, and yet, even though it's not a significant act, still, if you make a vow and you lie about it, then one is still liable. Rabbi Yishmael omer, eno chav ela al ha'atid lavo, shneimar lehara o lehetib. Rabbi Yishmael, as we've learned earlier, but this is the main source here in the Mishnah, he is of the opinion that one is liable to bring a korban olev yored only if he makes a vow regarding the future. If he says, I will eat, and then he doesn't eat, or I won't eat, and he does eat. That is where he's liable. But, because it says, the Pasuk says, lehara or lehetiv, in the future, to do bad or to do good, and we interpret that as being something affirmative or negative regarding the future. But the Pasuk doesn't say anything about the past, and therefore, according to Rabbi Yishmael, one is not liable if he says, I slept yesterday, or I didn't eat yesterday, and he's lying. He is not liable to a korban. Amar lo Rabbi Akiva im ken, en li ela devrim shesh behen hara'a v'hataba, devrim she'en behen hara'a v'hataba minayin. Now Rabbi Akiva disagrees with Rabbi Yishmael. He has the standard opinion that regarding past and future, that's what we were assuming in all these examples where we mention both past and future examples. So Rabbi Akiva says, an argument against Rabbi Yishmael says, well, according to you, are you really only going to limit the korban liability to lehara or lehetiv, and they're not going to expand it to anything else? If so, if you're going to read lehara or lehetiv so literally, then you should understand it as something that will actually be morally bad and morally good. Maybe only if one makes a vow that I'm going to do something bad to someone, or or something good to someone, or something good in the world. Maybe it only applies to something that has a moral consequence, and not just I'm going to sleep or I'm not going to eat, which is not evil or good. So how do you know that you should expand hara'a v'hataba not just to moral good and evil, but to anything that's positive and negative? I will do something or I won't do something, right? So how do you know that? Amar lo miribuy hakatuv. Rabbi Yishmael says, oh, I know. I learned that from the expansion of the in the pasuk. This is the pasuk he's referring to. This is O nefesh ki teshabat That's the basic law. If you say something, this is why all these types of vows are called Shevuot bitui. That's important because in the rest of the daf we're going to see this compared to other types of Shevuot, like Shevuot Shav, Shevuot Sheker, Shevuot Hayedut. All those are going to come up. But this one is Shevuot bitui. I'm going to do something or not going to do something. So it mentions lehara or lehetiv. Now, if you take that literally, it's only about a future thing that has a moral aspect. But then it says lechol asher yivateh adam b'shvuah. So this is an expansion word. Anything that a person will utter with a vow, and then he forgets about it, and then he remembers, and so on. Then he has to bring korban olev yored. So because Rabbi Yishmael says it has a ribui, and it says all these things, kol asher yabateh. That's how I know it's not just moral and good, moral good and evil, but anything that is positive or negative. They're regarding the future. So Rabbi Akiba says, see, so you should agree with me, since the pasuk is giving an expansion and it's expanding it to anything that's positive and negative, not only morally good and bad, then you should expand it even further and apply it to things about the past. That's what I do. Rabbi Akiba says, I apply it to things about the past. But Rabbi Ishmael apparently says, no, I only expand it to regard anything in the future, but I don't expand it to talk about things in the past. That's the end of the Mishnah. Tenor Banan. Chomer b'nedarim me b'shvuot. Chomer b'shvuot me b'nedarim. Braita teaches that there are some aspects in which a neder is more stringent than a Shevuah, and in other ways, the other way around, a Shevuah is more stringent than a neder. Chomer b'nedarim shandin mechalim al devar mitzvah kedvar reshut mashen ken b'shvuot. A stringency regarding a neder is that a neder can apply to something that is a mitzvah, just like it applies to something that is an optional matter, which is not true for a Shevuah. For example, if someone makes a vow and says, I am not going to put on tefillin, that Shevuah is null and void, because you cannot make a Shevuah against something that's in the Torah. That's a basic rule. However, if the person says, tefillin are prohibited to me as a neder, so then that applies, because a neder does not apply to the person, but rather applies to the thing. And he's saying the thing, the item, tefillin, I can get no benefit from tefillin. Then he cannot. Then that does apply to the tefillin, and he cannot get benefit. Or I'm not going to sit in the sukkah. That's about himself. Shevuah. I'm not going to sit in sukkah. Null and void, because it goes against the Torah. But if he says, all these sukkahs are prohibited to me, then he cannot sit in the sukkahs, and that will take effect because it applies to the thing and not the person. Chomer b'shvuot she'shvuot chalot al davar she'en bo mamash kedavar she'yesh bo mamash mashen ken b'nedarim. And there's a stringency regarding Shevuot that a Shevuah can apply to something that has no substance. That's why this is being brought here, because we just mentioned in the Mishnah that applies to something that has no substance, as well as that something that has substance. Not true for nedarim. So if you say, I make a Shevuah that I will sleep or that I won't sleep, that Shevuah applies. And if he violates it and he says, I'm not going to sleep, and then he does sleep, he has to bring korban olev yored. But that's not true regarding a neder. You can't say, sleep is forbidden to me. You can't make a neder regarding something that's not tangible, like sleep. You can only make a neder to prohibit an item, but not not something that's not tangible. Kesad amar Shevuah she'eten lifloni v'shelo eten. Ma eten ilem asedaka lani mushbava min Har Sinai hu shenemar naton titen lo. Now, in the example of a vow, a Shevuah that relates to acherim, that relates to someone else, and it says, if I promise, I will give this some item to that person. That's the example that the Mishnah brought. So when he says that I will give, who is he talking about? Is it talking about giving tzedakah to a poor person? If so, he already made a vow on Har Sinai that if you see a poor person, you have to help him out. As the pasuk says, you shall surely give him. Don't leave him alone. So then he has to give it anyway. If he has to give it anyway, then the Shevuah would not apply. Ela matana le'ashir. Rather, it's not talking about giving tzedakah to a poor person, but rather giving a gift to a rich person or a person who's not poor. So I make a Shevuah. This thing I'm going to give to that person, as long as it's not tzedakah, which you have to give. Then the Shevuah will apply. Sheishan v'shelo ishan. The Mishnah mentioned the example of something and that is intangible, of sleeping and not sleeping. Ini v'hamar Rabbi Yochanan, ha'omer Shevuah shelo ishan shelosha yamim, malkin oto v'yashen le'altar. We have a challenge from a statement of Rabbi Yochanan. He said, if someone makes a Shevuah and says, I will not sleep for 3 days, what do you mean? No one can sleep, no one can stay awake for 3 days. It's physically impossible. So if someone makes a Shevuah like that, we consider that to be a mezid. From the beginning, from the second he makes that Shevuah, we know for sure he's going to violate it. So we don't even bother waiting until he falls asleep, because for sure he's going to fall asleep through the next 3 days. So instead, we give him lashes right now for making such a vow that he definitely is going to violate. And then he can go to sleep because he already got his punishment for it. What we see from here is that anybody who says, I'm not going to sleep, here it says 3 days. So all the more so if he says, I'm not going to sleep, stam, I'm not going to sleep ever. So for sure he's going to fall asleep. So we just give him malkut. Therefore, we would not give him korban olev yored. It's not like he's going to forget it later and then do it. Since we give him malkut later, there's no opportunity for him to forget it later to bring a korban olev yored. So when would he bring a korban olev yored for saying I'm not going to sleep? And the answer is hatam damar shelosha hachad lamar shelosha. In that case, he specified 3 days I'm not going to sleep. But the Mishnah is assuming a case where he didn't say 3 days, but he said something else. He said, I'm not going to sleep for the next 6 hours. Okay, that's possible for him not to sleep for 6 hours. So then we're not going to give him lashes. Maybe he'll fulfill his promise just fine. But if he does, in the end, violate his promise, bishogeg, then he will have to bring a korban olev yored. She'ezrok sero layam v'shelo ezrok. The Mishnah mentioned as one of the examples of something that's an inconsequential act that has no substance. If I make a vow, I will throw a stone into the sea, or I will not throw a stone into the sea, I am liable. Now we're going to see a variation on that case. Itamar, Shevuah shezarak ploni sero layam v'shelo zarak, Rav amar chayav u'Shmuel amar patur. So there's a machloket between Rav and Shmuel here that's going to involve our attention for the rest of the daf. So let's pay attention and get straight who says what. The case is not when I make a vow that I will throw a stone, or I will throw a stone, or will not throw a stone, but rather my Shevuah is about someone else. I make a Shevuah that person threw a stone into the sea, or that person did not throw a stone into the sea. We're going to see why that variation is important. It's because it's not in my power to do so in the future. If I make a vow about what I'm going to do in the future, well, that's certainly valid. I make a vow I'm going to eat or not eat. I'm going to make a vow I'm going to throw the stone or not throw the stone. So since it's in my power to fulfill it or not fulfill it, I am liable if I don't. But here, I'm making a vow about someone else's action. Okay, now there's going to be a difference whether it's in the past or in the future. If it's about the past, so then I should be able to tell, I know that he did. I saw him do it. This is a fact that happened already. But if I say it about the future, it's going to be more problematic, as we're about to see in a minute, because about the future, it's not in my power to know or to make him throw a stone or not throw a stone. So am I still liable in the future, and does that affect the past version of it? Okay, we're going to see all this. But for now, we see that Rav says one is liable if he makes a vow and it turns out not to be true, he's liable. And Shmuel says he's not liable even if I make a vow and I say, this person threw a stone into the sea. And in fact, he didn't throw a stone. I'm not liable according to Shmuel, even though what I set my vow is false about something that happened in the past, still not liable. All right, let's try to figure out why. Rav amar chayav ite bela vehen, u'Shmuel amar patur lete belehaba. Rav says he is liable because this fits into the principle of ite bela vehen. This is an important principle. Let's assume within the Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva says one is liable for a vow, both for the future and for the past. Unlike Rabbi Shmuel, who says only for the future, but not for the past. So let's focus within Rabbi Akiva, who says you are liable both for the future and the past. There's an additional requirement. In order to be liable, it has to be that the vow that you make has to be able to be formulated both in the past, and both in the positive and in the negative. In other words, you have to, if you say something in the positive, you have to be able to also say a negative. And if you say a negative, it has to be able that you said in the positive. We learned this from lehara or lehetiv. So if I say I will eat, So that is a valid vow because I could vow I won't eat. Now, even though I'm not vowing in the negative, but still, since I could formulate it in the negative, it's valid in the positive. And the other way also. If I say I'm not going to eat or I'm not going to throw a stone into the sea, that's valid because I could say I will throw it into the sea. Now, within Rabbi Akiva, everybody agrees to this rule that in order for a Shevuot to be valid, has to fulfill the requirement that you could formulate it both in the positive and in the negative. And Rav has that rule. And Rav has only that rule. Shemuel, however, has an additional rule. And Shemuel says, in order for a Shevuot to be valid, it has to be that you can formulate it both in the future and in the past. Oh, this is a whole new ball game. You have to be able to say it in the future and the past. Otherwise, even if you only said it in the future, it's not, and you could not formulate it in the past. It's not valid even for the future. And so that's the case here. If someone says, I make a vow that person threw a stone into the sea. Now, that you can formulate that in the past. It makes sense for him to make a vow, whether he saw him throw it into the sea or not. However, can you switch it to the future? Would it be a valid formulation? Let's try. I make a vow that this person will throw something into the sea. This is not valid because it's not in my power to know or to decide or to make that person throw it into the sea. Since it's not in my power to fulfill or not fulfill it, it's not my decision, therefore it's an invalid vow in the future. Because if I formulate it in the future, it would be invalid, so too, even when I formulate it in the past, according to Shemuel, it is invalid. So Shemuel has a double rule, really. He would agree with Rav's rule that it has to be ite bela vehen. In this case, it is ite bela vehen, but Shemuel has a different additional rule that it has to be that you can formulate it le'avad u'lehaba, and here you cannot do so. Okay, that's the reasoning behind Rav and Shemuel. Now we're going to propose a simpler reason. Why are you going into this? You could formulate it otherwise. Why can't you explain Rav and Shemuel in a simpler way? Lema b'plukta de Rabbi Yishmael v'Rabbi Akiva kami palgeh. Maybe Rav and Shemuel are arguing along the lines of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva from our Mishnah. Ditnan. Rabbi Yishmael omer, eno chayav ela al ha'atid lavo, shneimar lehada o le'ativ. Amar lo Rabbi Akiva. אם כן, אין לי אלא דברים שיש בהן הדעה והטבה, דברים שאין בהם הדעה והטבה מניין, אמר לו מריבוי הכתוב, אמר לו אם ריבה כתוב לכך, ריבה כתוב לכך. Word for word, quote from the Mishnah that we just learned, that according to the Ishmael, one is not liable for, one's only liable for future, but not for past, because it says lehada or lehetiv, to do this in the future. And Rabbi Akiva says, why are you saying anything in the future? Why not just say only if it's morally good and bad? And Rabbi Ishmael answered, no, I'm learning it from because the pasuk says any type of vow. So by saying any type of vow, we're including also anything positive and negative, not only morally good and bad. And then Rabbi Akiva said, if so, then you should include also the past. So Rabbi Akiva includes the past, and Rabbi Ishmael does not include any vows in the past. One was not liable. So Rav damar ke Rabbi Akiva, Ishmael damar ke Rabbi Ishmael. So we could explain simply that Rav follows Rabbi Akiva, and therefore this vow, which is about the past, make a vow that person threw something into the sea, well then that's in the past, so Rabbi Akiva would say chayav. And Shemuel says batur, that's because he's following Rabbi Ishmael, who says that any vow in the past, one is not liable. So isn't that a simple explanation? Now it doesn't sound like this is actually the peshat, because why are they talking about a case of when someone else threw it into the sea? Just talk about when I threw it into the sea. I mean, it's a simpler case. Why you have to go to a more complicated case when you're talking about someone else? So it definitely does seem that there's something more going on in this machloket. And furthermore, we don't want to have each the Amoraim argue along the same lines as the Tanaim, because then they could just say, I agree with Rav, or Rav could just say, Halacha is like Rabbi Akiva, and everybody's going to be we're going to want to be like Rabbi Akiva. So we don't want to limit to Shemuel to being only like Rabbi Ishmael. And so therefore we say, no, our original interpretation over here was the correct one. And the relationship to Rabbi Ishmael and Rabbi Akiva is as follows. Alibad Rabbi Ishmael kula amala pelige. Hashta milatad ita belhaba lamechayev ala Rabbi Ishmael l'she'abar milatad eleta belhaba mibaya. No, if you're going to follow Rabbi Ishmael, everyone would agree Rav and Shemuel would all agree that one is not liable, because if in a case where you could formulate it in the future, a regular case where it's easy to formulate in the future, you say, I ate yesterday. I could formulate that. I will eat, and that would be valid. And yet, even there, the Bishmael says patur, because in the past he doesn't say anything. He says anything in the past is not valid. So something that cannot be formulated in the future, because you can't say, I vow that that person will do something. So all the more so, certainly the Bishmael would say that this is invalid when you said it in the past. Okay, so the Bishmael, for sure, there's no disagreement within the Bishmael. Ki peligel ibad Rabbi Akiva Rav ki Rabbi Akiva u'Shmuel amar ad kan la mechayev Rabbi Akiva hatam l'sha'avar ela milata de'ita b'lahaba mechayev Rabbi Akiva l'sha'avar halamida delete b'lahaba la. Rather, the machlok between Rav and Shmuel is within the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. Rav follows Rabbi Akiva simply any vow that's in the future or in the past, as long as you can formulate it with a positive and negative. That requirement we still have. You have to be able to say, I will and I won't, or I did and I didn't. The positive and the negative in order to be valid. Yes, that's true. But as long as it's in the future or the past, that's totally fine. Doesn't have to be transferable from one to the other. Whereas Shemuel says, no, Rabbi Akiva, when he says one is liable for something in the past, that's only if you could formulate it in the future and it would be a valid vow, and one would be liable if you violated the future version of it. Then Rabbi Akiva says, in that case, when you formulate it in the past, also it is liable. However, if it's something that you cannot formulate in the future, like here, where it's impossible to say someone else will do something in the future, since that's invalid if you would formulate in the future, so too, even Rabbi Akiva would agree that when you formulate it in the past, it's not valid, and that's the opinion of Shemuel. Next, we're going to try yet another interpretation of the machlok between Rav and Shemuel, but we're going to end up rejecting it and coming back to the place that we are now. So we ask, Lema biplukta Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera v'Rabanan kamipalge. Perhaps Rav and Shemuel are arguing along the same lines as the following machloket between Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera and the other rabbis. That is a mishnah that's going to be coming up in 2 dapim from now. Ditnan nishba lebatel et hamisva velo bitel patur lekayem et hamisva velo kiyem patur shaya bedin sheyeh chayab kidibrei Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. So the rule of Tanakama is, if someone makes a vow that they will not do a mitzvah, but then they end up doing it. A person makes a vow, I am not going to eat matzah this year. Not eating matzah, make a vow. And then, in the end, they ate matzah. They are not liable, even though they did not fulfill the words that they said, because one cannot make a vow against the Torah. And so therefore someone says, I'm not going to eat matzah. That is null and void, and so he should eat matzah, and he will fulfill the mitzvah, and he will not have to bring a korban for this vow. And the opposite case, if he makes a vow, I will eat matzah this year on Pesach, and then he didn't, he's also not liable. Okay, so we're going to see why. Now, you might have thought that one would be liable in that case. When it says it positive, I will fulfill a mitzvah, you might have thought, based on a kal vachomer, that one should be liable, as according to what Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says, who disagrees with this law. He thinks that one is liable for saying, I will perform a mitzvah. Damar Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera. Umay im hareshut she'eno mushpa aleha mahar Sinai hareu chayav aleha. Mitzvah shemushpa aleha mahar Sinai eno din sheyeh chayav aleha. Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera makes a simple kal vachomer. If an optional action like I will sleep tomorrow, whatever, where one is not obligated from Har Sinai, and yet if I make a vow about that, then and I don't fulfill it, I am liable. Then all the more so a mitzvah where I am obligated already from Har Sinai. If I add another obligation through a vow and I say I will eat matzah on Pesach, all the more so I should be liable. If I'm liable for doing whatever, just eating a snack tomorrow, and I don't need a snack, I'm liable. So if I make a vow for something that I anyway have to do and don't do it, I should be even more liable. So the Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera says, although he agrees with the first law, if you say I'm not going to do a mitzvah, then you're not liable, even if you do it. But if you say, I'm going to do a mitzvah, then yes, you're adding a extra liability, and you have to bring a korban for that. So that seems to make sense. But the rabbis respond, Amru lo. Im amarta b'shvat hareshut sheken asa ba lav kehen. Tomar b'shvat mitzvah sheken lo asa ba lav kehen. So the rabbis say, you can't compare them when it comes to something, an optional activity. In that case, you can change from positive to negative. Just like you could say, I will sleep tomorrow. You could also say, I won't sleep tomorrow. And both of those would be valid. So you see, they have the principle that we already discussed, that Rav says, and Shemuel agrees with, seemingly, before we said that, Shemuel agrees with it. So the principle that in order for something to be valid, it has to be that you can formulate it in both the positive and the negative. So we find that regarding the shoot. So therefore, we're going to apply that also to mitzvah. And when it comes to mitzvah, you cannot say it in a positive and negative. Since you cannot say, I will not eat a matzah on Pesach, that's invalid, it goes against the Torah. So too, it's invalid to say, I will eat matzah on Pesach. That's the reason. So we see, according to Rabbanan, you have to be able to formulate in the positive and the negative. Whereas if according to Yehuda ben Betara, he doesn't have this rule. He says, even if you can only formulate it in the positive, I will do something, and the negative wouldn't make sense, still you violate for the positive. So let's try to match this up. Perhaps Rav, now Rav says that no, it's a little confusing here, because Rav really does say that you have to be able to formulate it in the positive and negative, and that's what we're going to answer in a second. But for now, Rav says that you don't have to formulate it in the past and the future, right? That was it. It doesn't matter the fact that you can't formulate in the future, but you can formulate in the past, and you can say that person did throw a stone, even though you couldn't say it in the future. That person will throw a stone. So Rav says, it doesn't matter if you said it, you don't have to say it and be able to say it in the past and the future. So maybe he would agree with Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, who says that you don't have to say it in positive and negative. And Shemuel followed Rabbanan. Just like Rabbanan say, you have to be able to formulate it in the positive and negative in order to be valid. So too, perhaps they would agree that you have to be able to formulate it in the past and the future, which is what Shemuel said. So maybe they're trying to conflate the positive negative with the past future. And maybe someone who has both, someone that would say either you need both or neither of these criteria, but we reject that also. It's not true. So now we reject that possibility, and we explain that if you'd follow Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, everyone would agree, Rav and Shemuel would agree that within Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, the vow that we mentioned would be valid. If someone said, I make a vow that person threw a stone, that would be a valid vow, and one would be liable if it was not true. Why? Because if Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera does not require that it has to be formulated in the positive and the negative. And the positive and negative one, that's explicit in the pasuk, lehara or le'ativ, more or less explicit in the pasuk. And even for that, he says, even if it's just lehara, just negative, or just positive, it's a valid vow. Then certainly he will not require that you be able to, that you have to formulate it in the past and the future, because the past and the future one, that is only derived from any vow that you will utter. So that is less required. And so if he doesn't require the positive and negative formulation, certainly he will not require the past and future formulations, and therefore, even though you can't say this person will throw it in the future, Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera certainly said, "Oh, who cares if you can't say it in the future? You can say it in the past, so then one is liable." So everybody would agree that, according to Rabbi Yehuda ben Betera, one would be liable for this formulation. Ki pelige alibad Rabbanan Shemuel kerabanan verav ki la mechayev Rabbanan belavehen tichtiv lahara ulati behedya aval haba l'shavar de merebuya de kreatu mechayeve. So the machlok between Rav and Shemuel is all within Rabbanan. And Rabbanan, what they said explicitly in the Mishnah is that you have to be able to formulate something in the positive and the negative in order to be liable. If we assume that just like they require positive and negative, so too they require that it has to be able to be formulated in the past and the future. So that's what Shemuel says. Shemuel would follow the simple reading of Rabbanan, that it's the same thing. Why would you make a difference? Right? Just like you have to be able to formulate it in the positive and negative, is what they said. So presumably, you have to be able to formulate it in the past and the future also. And this one, you cannot formulate it in the future, and therefore, it's not valid in the past either. So that Shemuel would be understanding Rabbanan in that way. And Rav, well, they could say that the Rabbanan only obligate someone if you can formulate it in the positive and the negative. And that requirement is based on the more explicit part of the pasuk, lehara or lehetiv. So it has to be that's something that you could say in the negative and could say in the positive. Then you're liable if you say it in one or the other. But how do we know regarding the future and the past? That's from the extension, the extra words that says lechola sherivateh adam bishvua. So since that's only learned from the expansion of the pasuk, so here the Rabbanan may very well agree that it does not, you don't need that it has to be formulated both in the future and the past, even if you can only formulate it in the past, like in this case, but you cannot formulate in the future. Nevertheless, one is liable. And so the machlok between Rav and Shemuel is not parallel to the machlok between the Rabbanan and the Yehuda ben Betera, but rather we explain it as we did before. Mativ Rav Hamnuna. Now Rav Hamnuna is going to challenge Shemuel, who said that you have to be able to formulate it in the past and the future. And the challenge is from a Mishnah coming up later in this Masechet. Lo acharti hayom velo hinachti tefillin hayom mashbiacha ani v'amar amen hayav. If someone says, I did not eat today, or someone says, I did not put on tefillin today, and then the other person he's talking to says, make a vow. And he says, amen, yes, I make a vow to that. And if it was in fact false and he did eat or he did put on tefillin, he is liable. Let's analyze. Bishlama lo acharti ite belo ochal. Ela lo hinachti mi ite belo aniach. We understand the case of I did not eat because one could formulate that in the future and say I will not eat. Since you can formulate in the future, the past version is valid and that's why it's chayav. But if you say, I did not put on tefillin today, can you formulate in the future and say, I will not put on tefillin? Well, that would go against the mitzvah. And so any Shevuot that's against the mitzvah is not valid. Since it's not valid if you would formulate in the future, according to Shemuel, it's also not valid in the past. So why does it say chayav? Who motiv la v'hu mefarek la. Rav Hamnuna asked the question, and he also provided the answer. Nice of him. Listadin katane lo acharti lekorban. Lo hinachti lemalkot. You have to explain when it says chayav, it's not chayav in the same way for both, but rather you have to split the meaning of chayav. When in the first case he says, I did not eat, and if he's lying, then he has to bring a korban if he does a bishogeg. But when he says, I did not put on tefillin, if it turns out that he's lying and he did put on tefillin, then if he does it on purpose, that's when he would be chayav and he would be liable to lashes. But you're right, if he did it bishogeg, if he said this vow and lied, it was false, bishogeg, then he would not bring a korban olev yored because of the principle that since you cannot formulate in the future, it's not liable to a korban in the past. That's only bishogeg. But if it was b'mezid, then everyone would agree that one is liable. Shemuel would agree that one is liable. Mativ Rava. And now a challenge from Rava, also against Shemuel. Ezohi Shevuot Shav. A Mishnah says, what is a Shevuot Shav? Shav is a vain oath. That's just something that's as black as white is black, something totally, it's not even like, I did this, where, maybe you did, maybe you didn't. Something that is just false on its face. Obviously false. נשבע לשנות את הידוע לאדם, ועמד על עמוד של אבן שהוא במקום פלוני שהוא של זהב, ואמרו לה והוא שניכר לשלושה בני אדם, תמה דניכר הלא ניכר עובר משום שבועת ביטוי, ועמי האינו ביהא של זהב. The Mishnah teaches that if someone makes a vow to change or deny something that is well known to everyone. For example, if he says regarding a pillar that's a stone pillar that's in a certain place, and he says, I make a vow that is made out of gold. So Ula said, so that person, that's a Shevuot Shav. They'd be liable as a Shevuot Shav, not Shevuot Bitui. Now Ula said, when is that true that will be a Shevuot Shav? If the fact is known to at least 3 people that's really made out of stone. If no one ever saw it, it's some hidden away thing that only one person or 2 people saw, well then that's not a Shevuot Shav. It's only called Shevuot Shav that it's false on the face of it if 3 or more people know that it's made out of stone. So we can infer from this that the only reason one is liable as a Shevuot Shav is because it's well known to 3 or more people. But what if it would not be well known? What if only this one person knows it? He's an archaeologist, he saw the stone, he uncovered it in a certain place. In that case, he would not be liable as a Shevuot Shav, but rather we assume he would be liable as a Shevuot Bitui. So you are liable for a Shevuot Bitui in this case, but why? Here, you cannot flip it to the future. What are you going to say? I'm making a vow that this will be gold? It can't turn into gold if it's made out of stone. It's impossible to make a vow about something in the future that's out of your hands. This is even more out of your hands than saying that person will throw a stone. Maybe you could pay him $10 to throw a stone. Here, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? Turn the stone into gold? So here, it's impossible to turn it into the future, and yet one would be liable to a Shevuot Bitui if it was known only to 1 or 2 people. Hu motiv lav u'mefarek la. Rava answered the question himself. Nikad over mishum Shevuot Shav, lo nikad over mishum Shevuot Sheker. No, this inference that we made from the words of Ula is not correct. If it's known to 3 people, then that's a Shevuot Shav. It's just totally invalid. If it's known only to 1 or 2 people, then one is liable as for a Shevuot Sheker. Shevuot Sheker is different from a Shevuot Shav. It's also different from a Shevuot Bitui. This is a violation of the 10 Commandments. Do not take the name of God in vain. And yes, one would be liable for that. One would have lashes if one did it on purpose. But that's talking about Shevuot Sheker. In fact, we cannot derive the inference here that, then he would be liable to Shevuot Bitui is not a necessary inference. אמר אביי, ומודה רב באומר לחברו, שבועה שאני יודע לך עדות, וישתכחת לא ידע לה, תפטור. הואיל ולית בכלל שאיני יודע לך עדות. Abaye says that even Rav will agree with the following case. Remember, Rav does require that you need to be able to formulate in the positive and a negative. What he does not require is that you have to formulate in the past and the future. It doesn't matter, even if it's only in the past or only in the future, it's still a valid vow. And yet, Rav would agree in the following case, where someone says to his friend, I have a Shevuah that I know testimony about you. And turns out he actually doesn't know testimony about this person, that he is not liable. It's invalid. Why is it invalid when he says this? He says he formulates it in the positive. I know testimony. It's invalid because it cannot be said in the negative. If he says that I do not have testimony about you, then that would not be a Shevuot Bitui. Why? Because that would fall under a different category of Shevuot Ha'edut. Shevuot Ha'edut means that I come and testify, says, I don't know any testimony about you, about this case. It turns out he's lying afterwards, so then that's called Shevuot Ha'edut. Because that is a distinct category that's discussed in Vayikra 5:1. If anyone sin, and that he hears a voice of adjuration, he being a witness, whether he has seen or known, if he does not utter it, he shall bear his witness. He says, I don't know anything, and he does know something. That's Shevuot Ha'edut. Because the negative formulation is part of a separate category of Shevuot Ha'edut. Therefore, the positive formulation, I do know testimony, doesn't count. Because remember, Rav says you do have to be able to formulate it in the positive and the negative. And here, although you can formulate it in the negative and it will be a valid vow, but it's a valid Shevuot Ha'edut, not a valid Shevuot Habitui. And therefore, since the negative is not a Shevuot Bitui, but rather Shevuot Ha'edut, so to the positive will not be a valid Shevuot Bitui, and one would be patur. Yadati v'lo yadati machloket, he'adati v'lo hadati machloket. Now, what if he says, I knew testimony, or I didn't know testimony in the past? So this would be a case where it's not relevant anymore. The case is already closed, whatever happened, and now he comes and says, I did know testimony, or I didn't know testimony, or about the past, I testified, or I didn't testify about this case. That would be subject to machlok between Rav and Shemuel. Rav would say that all these are valid because you can say it in positive and negative. He just said it right here. I knew testimony, I didn't know testimony. I did testify, I didn't testify. Those are all valid, and therefore, according to Rav, one would be liable if you lied about that. According to Shemuel, all of these past ones would be not valid because you cannot flip it to the future. You can't say, I will know testimony in the future about you, or I won't know testimony. How do you know if you're going to know testimony about something that's in the future? Or I will testify about your case, or I won't testify. There's no way you can know now. It's not in your hands to make it happen or not make it happen. It's not like I will eat or I will not eat, where it's in your free will to make that happen or not happen. Here, there's no way that you can decide that you will know or won't know, or that you will testify or won't testify. And so since Shemuel says, since you cannot flip it to the future, also it's not valid in the past. Good. That's Abaye's statement. Now that we know that, we have a question on Rav. It makes sense according to Shemuel. Since something that is formulated, if you would formulate in the future would not be liable, so too in the past you are not liable. That's why the Torah has to specify a case of Shevuot Ha'edut. When someone says, I don't know anything about this case, because this would not fit into Shevuot Bitui, since you cannot say it in the future, I will not know anything about this case. When he says, I did not testify, I did not witness anything about this case in the past one is not valid because the future version is not valid. Since the past one is not valid as a Shevuot Bitui, that's why the Torah has to go out of its way to say, if you testify that you don't know anything about a case, that's a special law, Shevuot Ha'edut. We need Shevuot Ha'edut because otherwise there is no Shevuot Bitui in that case. But according to Rav, who says one would be liable to Shevuot Bitui if he said, even though in the future he can't say, I won't know something in the future, that's not valid. But it doesn't matter. Even if it's not valid in the future, it's valid in the past according to Rav. If you say, I didn't see anything about your case, that would be a valid Shevuot Bitui. So why does the Torah have to come and say, there's a new category of Shevuot Ha'edut? It's included already under the prohibition of Shevuot Bitui. That's the question against Rav. So the rabbis, they thought of a proposition, the colleagues of Abaye, or the students, and they said in front of Abaye, maybe it's to require that he has two korbanot. He's going to bring two liabilities, two korban olev yorez, one as Shevuot Bitui and one for Shevuot Ha'edut. That's why you have an extra Shevuot Ha'edut to say this is really serious. Okay, that could be a good answer. Amar lehu tarate lamasitu amaritu. Tetanya leachat me'ele leachat ata mechayevo v'ata mechayevo shetayim. And Abaye says, no, it can't be. We never have two korban olev yorez. As the Braita said, this is in Vayikra 5:5. After 5:1 talks about Shevuot Ha'edut. After that talks about Shevuot Bitui. And then in 5:5 it says, if one is liable to one of these. We learn from here that you can only be liable to one such korban at a time and not two. And therefore, no, you're not going to be liable to two. That's not why the Torah is coming and saying this category of Shevuot Ha'edut. Okay, so Abaye doesn't like their answer. So then, what's his answer? Why does the Torah specify this case to be liable Shevuot Ha'edut if you already be liable to Shevuot Bitui? The answer is, as the Braita teaches, regarding all the other cases in that paragraph, it says v'ne'elam. If it's hidden from him and he forgot about this, forgot what he did a bishogeg, then he's liable to bring korban olev yored. But regarding Shevuot Ha'edut, it does not say v'ne'elam. That teaches us that one is liable to bring a korban for Shevuot Ha'edut, even if he does it b'mezid. He intentionally hid his evidence and said, I don't know anything about it, and made a swear on it. He is nevertheless liable to bring a korban. Most of the time, a korban chatat is only for shogeg, but there are a few exceptions where you have to bring korban chatat even for mezid. That's what it's coming to teach us. So the rabbis still want to do the double. They really want to give it to this guy. So it's okay. Maybe we can say as follows: if one says a vow vow like this: I don't know any testimony. I didn't see anything. Then if he does it b'mezid, he's liable to 2 counts. One Shevuot Edut and if he does it b'mezid, then he's liable to 1 count Shevuot Edut, because Shevuot Edut applies b'mezid. And if he lied and made this vow b'shogeg, he forgot that he knew it, then he'd be liable to 2. 1 because of Shevuot Edut and 1 because of Shevuot Bitui. So maybe that's why it says Shevuot Edut to add, yet also, number 1, to add b'mezid, that you're chayav, and also that you'd be liable to b'shogeg, to be liable to 2 of them. Amar lehu lav hainu damari la'achat ata mechayavo v'yata mechayavo shetayim. And so Abaye said, I just told you that we learned from the word la'achat that you're only liable to 1 at a time, and therefore if he does it b'mezid, then he would be liable to 1 korban ha'edut. And if he did it b'shogeg, then he'd be liable also to only 1. Maybe that would still be a Shevuot ha'edut, because that would override the Shevuot bitui. But he'd be liable only to 1 and not to 2. V'b'mezid mi'ika tarte. Now, if there was 2, would there be? If there was b'mezid, would there be 2? No, there can't be 2. There has to be only 1 korban for 1 action.
רבא אמר משום דהבה דבר שבכלל ויעשה לידון בדבר חדש אין לך בו אלא חידושו בלבד. Rava says, I agree with what Abaye just said, that one does not bring 2 korban ole veyoreds for just 1 false vow. You never have that. But I don't need to learn it from the word le'achat. I can derive it from one of the principles, one of the midot shasran jeshet bahen, is that if you have a law that really, a case that should be included in a general category, and yet the Torah comes and specifies a law about it, so yasa lidon, and says something new about it, you only have the new law applies to that case and not the law of the general category. And that applies exactly here. A Shevuot, a case of Shevuot Edut, a case where someone says, I didn't see it, I don't know any testimony about you. That would fit into the general category of Shevuot Bitui. And if it said nothing else, one would be liable, Korban Oleh V'Yored, for a Shevuot Bitui. So why does the Torah have to come and say something extra about this, Yatsa, exclusion, and say, if it's this type of Shevuah regarding testimony, then one is liable. Why are you saying anything about this at all? It comes to me to say that we're going to apply only this specific law to that case and not the general law. And that would include, yes, b'mezid, one is liable, and therefore, in the shogeg also, one is liable only as a Shevuot ha'edut and not a Shevuot ha'bitui at all. So you see, Rava, I can learn from this general principle that you only have 1 korban here. I don't know the word me'achat. I can learn from here that yasa, it excludes itself from the general, and therefore the Shevuot ha'edut is no longer a Shevuot bitui at all. Since Rava said that we learned from here, so there could be a practical difference between them, in that Rava would say Shevuot bitui never applies in the first place at all, because it's yatsa. Whereas according to Abaye, the Shevuot bitui exists in the world, and really he is liable in principle to Shevuot bitui and Shevuot ha'edut. But because of the law, only 1, so he can only bring 1 korban. But the other ones like hanging out there, that if it's for some reason the Shevuot ha'edut wouldn't be there, the Shevuot bitui would be hanging there. ואמר אביי מודה רב, ואומר לחברו שבועה שאני יודע לך עדות, וישתכחת לה ידע לד, פטור ולת בעיני יודע לך עדות. But how could that be? Does Abaye really think that it exists in the world? Doesn't Abaye say that according to Rav would agree that if someone says, I know that I know testimony about you, and turns out he doesn't know, patur. Why? Because you could not turn that negative into a positive. If you would say, I do know, that would not be a valid Shevuot bitui. We see here that there is no Shevuot bitui in the world at all. Because if there were Shevuot bitui, even in principle, although you wouldn't bring korban, but if it did exist in principle, then you could formulate it in the negative. And if you could formulate it in the negative, then you should be able to formulate it in the positive. Abaye therefore seems to agree with Rava's reasoning, rather than
than his own reasoning of me'achat. And so we have two answers. One, hadar be'abaye me'ahi. Maybe Abaye changed his mind. Changed his mind about what? Maybe he changed his mind about the derivation. It's not me'achat. Maybe he agrees with Rava. Maybe he changed his mind about this statement that he said that what Rav would agree with. Maybe he changed his mind about that. Or another answer, chadaminayhu Rav Papa amara. One of those statements maybe was not actually said by Abaye, but it was said by Rav Papa. Rav Papa was a student of Abaye, and sometimes he said things and wasn't always clear whether he was saying it in his own opinion, or quoting someone else, or whether he was quoting Abaye. Sometimes he said something, everybody was assuming, Rav Papa must be quoting the opinion of his teacher, Abaye. But that's why we were quoting it, which is really a fascinating idea. The fact that when it says sometimes Abaye said, maybe he didn't really say it. Maybe a student said it, and we assumed that it was a teacher, that he got it from his teacher. But that's an assumption, and it may not apply in all cases. So one of these statements may actually be by Rav Papa and not by Abaye. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.